New South Wales police have confirmed the state's most wanted fugitive was once again close enough for them to identify, yet officers failed to capture him. Malcolm Naden has been on the run for almost 7 years, wanted for murder and sexual assault and the shooting of a police officer last month. But rather than painting this latest escape as a bungle, police are claiming a success of sorts.
Malcolm John Naden was born on the 5th of November 1973 in the New South Wales Orana region in a town called Dubbo. Dubbo is 400 kilometres northwest of Sydney and currently has a population of almost 40,000 people. Dubbo is where the story begins, but far from where it ends, as where it ends is one of the biggest manhunts in the history of New South Wales. A manhunt that would last 7 years and include many sightings and close calls. Not much is known about Malcolm Naden's early life, except he grew up in a part of Dubbo that had a large percentage of Aboriginal residents and a high level of crime and large public housing developments. The crime was so bad that after a single housing development was completely demolished in 2006 and the residents were dispersed to other locations, Dubbo dropped from the 26th to the 46th place on a list of the most break-and-enters committed in all of New South Wales. It would be only a few hundred metres from this now demolished development that Malcolm Naden would commit murder. On the 21st of June 2005, Christy Scholes and her 2 young children spent the night at her grandparents' home at the address number 215 Bungle Gumby Road, Dubbo. Christy and her children were the only occupants of the residence that night, as the rest of her family had made the trip to Sydney to see her grandfather who was undergoing heart surgery. Christy was last seen about 9 PM that night by a neighbour. She also made a call to a family member at around 9:30. In that phone call, she would tell the relative on the other end of the phone that she was feeling uneasy in the residence. The next morning, a neighbour spotted one of Christy's children climbing through a window. Thinking this was an odd occurrence, the neighbour made his way to the house, let himself in, and found both of Christy's children in a room, which had been locked from the outside. The neighbour was not able to locate Christy and spent the rest of the day trying to locate her, without success. The police were contacted at around 10 PM that night. Subsequently, a detective by the name of Sue Ellen Scott and 2 unnamed uniformed police attended the residence. First they spoke to the neighbour and then some of the family members of Christy before conducting a physical search of the premises. It was at this point that they located 2 locked bedroom doors. It was decided that the door of the spare room would be opened by force. On gaining access to the room, Detective Sue Ellen Scott would later state, "Immediately upon opening the door, it was apparent that there was a pile of bedding or clothing or blankets. We pulled them back and found Christy's body." According to one of the detectives working the crime scene, it wasn't initially clear that a crime had taken place. There were aspects of the scene that could have been misinterpreted as suicide or death by misadventure, but within hours it became very clear that it was indeed a homicide. There was a window in the room that locked from the inside that had been jimmied open, and a hand-drawn picture of a female figure, naked from the waist up, that was scrawled onto one of the bedroom walls. The police soon believed that whoever perpetrated the crime spent time not only drawing on the wall, but also with Christy's body. When the police inquired into who usually stayed in that room, they were told it was Christy's 31-year-old cousin, Malcolm Naden. Upon further investigation, it was found Malcolm Naden was already wanted by the police in relation to the indecent assault of a 12-year-old girl. I'd just like to add something before I continue. Many media sources claim that Malcolm Naden was also wanted for indecently assaulting a 15-year-old girl. Whether this is a 12-year-old girl with the age incorrectly reported or a completely different girl is unknown. No matter how hard I dug into it in my research, I couldn't find a definite answer. Though the same publications that claim sexual assault against a 15-year-old in one article refer to a 12-year-old in others. So again, I'm not sure if they're two completely different victims or the same victim whose age was incorrectly reported. I just wanted to be upfront with that, and now back to the story. During the police investigation into the indecent assault of the 12-year-old girl, the police would visit the Bungle Road address in hopes of finding Naden, at which point Malcolm Naden's relatives would lie to police about his whereabouts, often claiming he was hours away in other locations, while in reality he was in the back bedroom of the residence. Malcolm's family claimed that after the indecent assault he would, quote, live in his room, unquote, which he'd rarely come out from. It is believed this is also the time that he left his job as a skinner and boner at the local abattoir. During the investigation of the crime scene in Malcolm Naden's past, it came to light that Christy's cousin, 24-year-old Letitia Nolan, went missing from this exact address only 6 months previously. On further inspection of the surrounding areas of where Christy's body was found, the police stumbled upon holes in the bathroom roof, holes cut for the distinct purpose of spying on those using the bathroom facilities. Malcolm Naden would climb into the roof cavity and partake in voyeurism on members of his own family. When Malcolm's family was confronted with the information, they stunned the police by claiming that Malcolm was a creep, and spying on them was only one of the many creepy tricks in his repertoire. They said he would often handwrite notes to those living in the residence, often his own relatives. The notes would be of a graphic sexual nature, where he would not only express his willingness to engage in sexual acts, but will use the notes to intimidate the receiver, claiming he was watching them. One of the family members would later claim, quote, my daughter got a letter pushed under her door. It was from Malcolm. It said, I watched you getting dressed. I watched what you do in the shower. You and I could have sex together, unquote. It was found out early on into the investigation that both Christy and Letitia had received similar notes from Malcolm, where he'd expressed the same willingness to engage in sexual acts, as well as bragging about his voyeurism to his own cousins. It was at this point during the initial investigation that the police started to firmly believe that there was not only a strong sexual aspect to Christy's murder, but more than likely to Letitia's disappearance as well. Something that would be realised in Christy's case, for on autopsy, the coroner would rule her cause of death as strangulation, and that she had been sexually assaulted post-mortem. DNA was also collected at the scene, DNA that matched Malcolm Naden. One of the biggest sources of DNA came from the collar of Christy's turtleneck top. The large amount of DNA collected on this article of clothing was, of course, due to the manual strangulation Christy had suffered. Malcolm Naden had just sealed his fate. He had just become the most wanted man in all of Australia. He was now wanted over the indecent assault of a 12-year-old girl, the death of his cousin Christy Scholes, and his involvement in the disappearance of his other cousin, Letitia Nolan. But Malcolm had already fled the area, his whereabouts completely unknown. The police were soon to realise Malcolm Naden wasn't like other criminals. He didn't seek refuge at a friend's or relative's house. He didn't try to leave the country or assume a new identity. He just simply went on the run into the vast Australian bush. At this point, the police were working on the assumption that Malcolm Naden was in fact a master bushman, a person who could survive long periods of time without human contact, who could hunt and fish for sustenance, build and maintain shelter, and of course, avoid detection should he not want to be found. Working on this assumption, it was decided that the police would do a full media release, only weeks after him going on the lam. News programs and printed newspapers would plaster Malcolm's mugshot with the words "wanted" perched above it. The police wanted to get his mugshot out to as many people as humanly possible, not only in the hope of a tip giving his precise location, but also to restrict any interaction with the local businesses or people who may be able to unknowingly help him further elude police. Doing so basically closed any possibility of Naden hitchhiking to a location far from the crime, or simply going into a local shop for provisions. While that was not something he was known to do, it greatly reduced his options. Because of the media release, tips started flowing in at a rapid rate. People claimed to have seen him in every mainland state, from Northern Territory to Victoria. One tip even claimed they'd seen Malcolm Naden dressed as a female in the New South Wales suburb of Redfern. Each tip had to be followed up. Subsequently, none of the initial tips bared any worth to the investigation or the true whereabouts of Naden. But that was about to change when a New South Wales tourist spot reported a visual sighting as well as weird happenings around the staff quarters and animal enclosures. In December 2005, a full 6 months after the murder of Christy Scholes, the Dubbo Western Plains Zoo would contact police with the most reliable information and sighting to date. The zoo initially thought they had a simple trespasser on the grounds. They'd smell toast cooking at odd times of the night when the zoo was closed. Also, when the zoo was closed, they'd hear the animals barking and making noise, as if someone had disturbed them. But the most important piece of information was that someone had seen the perpetrator. A cleaner walked into a laundry room and saw a man she believed to be homeless rifling through clothing. Once confronted, the man hastily left the scene. The police then proceeded to take statements from other staff members. It was at this point that they were informed that numerous staff members had heard noises in the roof, both during the day while undertaking their zoo duties and in the staff cabins of a night. On hearing this, the police brought in a fingerprint technician to fingerprint the entrances to the roof cavity. Sure enough, they found prints belonging to Malcolm Naden on one of the manholes leading into the roof cavity. Malcolm had been living within the roof cavity and again began spying on those below. This not only meant that it was the first confirmed lead that the police had had in 6 months, it also meant that while the police were doing Australia-wide media appeals, Malcolm had moved only 8 kilometres from the Bungalgumby residence where Christie's body was found 6 months earlier. Police were fearful that Malcolm may become violent to female staff that he'd been spying on, and the decision was made to send in a tactical unit to apprehend him. The zoo was closed to the public and the massive property was searched. Malcolm was nowhere to be found. Working on the new information of Malcolm's last sighting, the police decided to offer a $50,000 reward, either for the capture or information that led to his capture. This would be the first time in over 100 years that Australia had a reward for the capture of a fugitive. Usually in Australia, rewards are offered only for the information leading to a capture, not the capture itself. But even though the police continued to work around the clock and the $50,000 bounty was now available, it would be another 14 months before the next confirmed interaction with Malcolm Naden. 14 months after slipping away from the tactical unit at Dubbo Zoo, a break-in was reported and investigated. On investigation, the police found blood on a window that was broken to gain access to the property. That blood sample was tested against Malcolm's DNA. It came back positive. But the most amazing thing about this break-in was the sheer distance from his last known location, a distance they believe he covered completely on foot, entirely through the bush. The break-in was at Stewart's Brook, New South Wales, a whopping 340 kilometres from Dubbo Zoo. This incident would allow police to form a rough modus operandi of how Malcolm was able to survive for so long in the harsh Australian bush. No longer did they believe he was the adept master bushman they once believed. They now saw him as a thieving scavenger. While there is little doubt that Malcolm was able to survive long periods in the bush alone, the picture was becoming clear. He was stealing supplies from farmhouses and residences as he went, a far cry from the rugged bushman he was purported to be. The break-ins and thefts also helped the police. It finally gave them a way to track his movements. It's not often that a would-be thief goes to the trouble of breaking into a house and stealing canned goods. cutlery, clothes or blankets, all of which seem of little value to someone looking for quick money. For someone evading the law in the bush though, they're as good as gold. It would be a full 8 months after the break-in at Stewart's Brook that Malcolm would resurface. In October 2008, Malcolm would surface 380 kilometers northeast of the break-in at Stewart's Brook at a place called Misty Mountain Health Retreat in Bellbrook, New South Wales. The Misty Mountain Health Retreat is a place you can visit to detox. It is surrounded by thick and dense bushland and is what many people would call rather remote. During the off-peak season, a 23-year-old female retreat worker by the name of Geraldine Pickering was staying there alone doing caretaker duties. She began to notice strange occurrences. She'd noticed canned goods went missing in the pantry, all of which were taken from the back as to appear nothing had been touched. Much like the Dubbo Zoo incident, she'd also smelled toast cooking, not something you'd expect to smell in such a secluded location. But there were 2 incidents that she witnessed and endured herself, something that couldn't be explained by incorrect inventory or an imaginary aroma. The first was when she caught Malcolm Naden off guard. She walked out of a cabin to see Malcolm standing there, as she is quoted as saying, "There was a man dressed completely in army clothes and like a balaclava, and he was just standing by the side of the building," unquote. She called out to him and he ran behind a building and disappeared. But the worst encounter was about to come. One night while sleeping in one of the cabins, she was startled awake by someone trying to open the door handle to gain access to the inside. As she lay there frozen with fear, he shined a torch through the glass door and watched her. After finding the courage to yell out, he turned and fled. On him fleeing, she called her boss and reported the incident. Her boss then reported it to the police. The police arrived to take a statement from Geraldine. She reported noises and knocks and just eerie things happening. She also said she felt she was being watched. Police became concerned as they believed the actions fit Malcolm's use of voyeurism. Because of this, police asked Geraldine to move to a neighbour's residence. When she went to her room to collect her belongings, she found a note which had not been there before. It simply read, "Nice moles." Something the police believe Malcolm saw while generally stalking her, or while she skinny dipped on the remote property. Police found Malcolm's DNA on the property and did an extensive search, using both ground and aerial units, but to no avail. He had slipped their grasp once again. After Malcolm escaped from the Misty Mountain Health Retreat, it would be a full 3 years before the police could come close again. During that 3-year hiatus, he continued to break into houses to steal items to survive. The usual dry and canned goods, clothes, cooking and eating utensils, but during the spate of break-ins he managed to steal firearms. So not only was he now highly elusive, highly dangerous and unpredictable, he was now also well armed. In a short amount of time, there had been a spate of break-ins during November 2011 in a small New South Wales town known as Nowandock, approximately 280 kilometers southwest of his last known location. Because break-ins were such a rare occurrence in these areas, as well as the public now being aware that a killer was on the run in such terrain, the public were quick to report them to the authorities. The 2 most recent were in tiny towns known as Alkira and Baranning in New South Wales. They were slightly outside of Nowandock. Because of the speed of these break-ins were reported, the police scrambled. They believed he couldn't be far from those locations. The tactical response unit was deployed on the ground, and aerial support was scrambled to the southeast of Nowandock. Both began to search the dense bushland for signs of life. It didn't take long for the ground units to see evidence of makeshift shelters, food wrappers, and other fresh signs of someone living in the area. After finding the initial evidence of human activity in the bush surrounding Nowandock, the tactical response unit continued through the thick scrub in hopes of finding the fugitive. They came across more signs of recent activity and almost used it as a trail of breadcrumbs. Going deeper into the bush, one of the dog handlers came across a length of PVC pipe. Inside it, he found 2 .22 rifles, a shotgun, and ammunition. He radioed his find into the rest of the team. They believed he wouldn't be far from the hidden weapon cache, and with newfound resolve, the team pushed on. The bush was thick and the terrain rugged, so rugged in fact, that the tactical unit would claim it was so thick that all Malcolm would have needed to do to avoid detection is simply crouch down where he was standing. And that's exactly what he did the next morning, when he raised his stolen rifle, aimed, and fired on the tactical unit. On the 7th of December 2011, just off Hawkins Road now in Dock, New South Wales, the tactical ground unit are closing in on Naden. While pushing through the scrub, one of the men in the unit spots the straight outline of a tarpaulin in the distance. They'd finally found his camp. The unit stopped and surveyed the area with their rifles raised. No sooner had they begun to formulate their next move, when from an unknown location a shot rang out. A unit member, known only as Brad, was hit in his right shoulder. The rest of the unit identified themselves while entering a contact drill position, still not able to tell Naden's location because of the thick brush and because of the amplified gunshot. The injured team member radioed command base with the unit's coordinates. Two other tactical unit members, Andrew and Sean, provided cover for Brad, who was now losing a large amount of blood from the shot which went straight through his shoulder. Brad would later say, quote, "They threw themselves on either side of my body, using their bodies to protect me after I'd been shot. That's pretty brave if you ask me," unquote. Because Brad had radioed in their coordinates, specialist ambulance officers were able to be deployed to extract him, with the help of a second tactical team. Brad is then airlifted to hospital, while the remaining ground forces continued to hunt Naden. They tracked him to the edge of a creek, but the scent went cold and he once again escaped. It was at this time that one of Malcolm's victims' wallets was found, almost 7 years after the unresolved disappearance. Letitia Nolan's wallet was found on a riverbank in a waterway in Dubbo, back where the police believe the crime took place. But Naden was living on borrowed time. Shooting at a police officer may have helped him escape at the moment, but it more or less sealed his fate. There isn't a resource they couldn't or wouldn't use now. The New South Wales Police Commissioner, Andrew Scipione, said, quote, "The New South Wales police world changed on the 7th of December 2011, when this man decided he was going to shoot and try to kill a police officer. All bets were off," unquote. The first thing the police did after the shooting was raise the reward from $50,000 to $250,000. They then brought in special operative officers to form a task force that would finally bring him to justice. Something that was helped along by Malcolm himself. After shooting the tactical unit member, he started to become sloppy. He started drinking more in the houses he broke into and made little effort to cover his tracks as he'd done in the past. 2 weeks after shooting the police officer, he would break into a house that had a very basic webcam surveillance system inside. The image captures a man with a torch, and the owner of the house is able to view the image remotely. It's of low resolution, but the police are taking no chances. The break-in is reported the following morning, and 2 general duty officers attend the location to take the report and notice suspicious activity immediately. The police stop at the front of the secluded property, equip bulletproof vests and draw their weapons. They shouted, "Is anyone home?" while taking cover behind their vehicle. They then approached the house, the officers once again asking, "Is anyone home? Come outside with your hands up." During this, they hear noises within the house. Moving around to get a better view, they see a rifle leaning up against the outside wall near the front door. They then see someone from inside the house approach the firearm. Naden appears at the doorway and reaches for the rifle. The police again shout, "Stop or we will shoot you," at which point he stops, turns, and retreats back into the residence. One officer retrieves the rifle while the other covers him. The 2 officers radio the tactical unit, but once again, he escapes. It is believed that once he turned back into the house, he ran straight out the back door. The rifle they recovered matched the gun that shot the tactical operative. DNA, ballistic, and fingerprint evidence linked Malcolm to the shooting. After searching the house, they find he spent hours upon hours on the owner's computer, doing nothing but look at porn, looking up rather twisted videos such as Mum Fucks Son, Panties Young, and Kissing Cousins. The police were growing tired of Naden and went about devising a plan to put him behind bars once and for all. They used his profile, behavioural pattern, and known modus operandi to lure him into a trap. Because they knew he would break into some houses more than once, they began to install electronic sensors and cameras around the perimeters of houses he'd broken into previously. On the 22nd of March 2012, the trap they set would be Ken's hut, a small isolated residence in Rawdon Vale, New South Wales. The police knew that with the continued pressure on Naden, his options were running out. Since his residence was remote and secluded, and the fact he'd broken in there previously to steal provisions and a firearm made it a perfect trap. The police filled the house with Naden's favourite food and waited. Once the sensors had alerted the police to his arrival, and after he had settled in, the strike force moved into position around the house. They had to walk across paddocks that were filled with livestock that were beginning to become spooked by their presence. One strike force member later stated that while moving through the paddock, a large bull began to charge. Not being able to move or give away their position, they held their ground. Luckily, the bull diverted at the last second. Once in position in the various vantage points, the tactical units could see signs of life within the house. They could see fire and smell someone cooking. As the strike force waited, Naden soon appeared at a back door, looked around and seemed to throw a cup of water in the general direction of one of the units. Fearing their position had been compromised, the unit made verbal contact, telling Naden to freeze, at which point he ran back through the house and tried to exit through the front door before being tackled. He was then wrestled onto his stomach and a police dog was clamped onto his leg. Once the flexi cuffs were put onto his wrists, the dog was removed. The police asked him to confirm who he was. He replied, "Malcolm Naden." He was then handed over to homicide detectives Ricky Hennessy and Paul Mangan, who would be the first to interview Naden back at Taree, New South Wales Police Station. 6 hours after Naden's arrest, the first interview would take place. He was upfront and willing to talk about his break and enter crimes, as well as things that took place while he was on the run. Once the conversation shifted to the topic of more serious crimes he was accused of, he would completely shut down, replying to questions with statements such as, "I wish to remain silent." He continues to reply to questions in that manner for over an hour, before admitting to shooting at the police. When Detective Ricky Hennessy says, "I'd like to ask you if that was the firearm you used to shoot at the police," Naden replied, "Yes, I will say yes to that." Naden was then transferred to Goulburn Supermax Prison. It was decided that nobody but homicide detectives Ricky Hennessy and Paul Mangan would interview or speak to him from now on. They had had several interviews with him in a short period, but he was reluctant to talk about the murder of his cousin Christy, the disappearance of his cousin Letitia, and the attempted murder of Brad, the tactical operative. Because of his unwillingness to talk, Detectives Hennessy and Mangan came up with a new plan. They tried to get him to write instead of talk, as he'd shown a willingness to do so in other situations. The detectives gave the ability to do so. Soon after, he would pen a 25-page confession. He would also state in the letter he'd be willing to plead guilty on all charges. After he penned the 25-page letter confessing his crimes, he would be formally interviewed again. He admitted to killing both Christy Scholes and Letitia Nolan. He also went on to say that when he had shot the tactical officer, he was aiming for the officer's chest and aiming to kill him. It's only by sheer luck that it missed his chest and instead hit his shoulder. He then goes on to claim that he has no doubt that if given the chance, he'd kill again. He believes that once you've killed someone, it's only natural to do it again. He then gives a full account of how both Christy Scholes and Letitia Nolan died. Regarding Christy Scholes, her 2 children were in a bedroom inside the Bungle Gumby Road residence. Christy had left them there while she used the bathroom. Malcolm came up from behind her and placed his hands around her throat. asphyxiating her to death. He then dragged her body into his room, removed her clothing, and then had sexual intercourse with her body. He then proceeded to draw her naked body on the bedroom wall. He seemed upset that she didn't put up more of a fight. He claims he thought she was merely passed out when he'd had sexual intercourse with her. The police claim he also gloated about killing a mother, and got off on the fact that her children were in such close proximity when he murdered her. After 8 years, he also disclosed the details of Letitia Nolan's disappearance and death. On the night of January 4th, 2005, Letitia Nolan had dropped 2 of her children off at the Bungle Gumby residence so her grandmother could watch them while she ran to do a quick errand. As she left the house and went to get into her car to leave, Malcolm was waiting for her. He asked if she could give him a lift to a place called Sandy Beach so he could go fishing. When they got to the destination, Letitia had stopped the car for Malcolm to exit. He claimed she brought up the indecent assault of the underage girl in 2004. He claims to have lost his temper and strangled her to death from behind. He was sitting in the rear passenger seat behind her. Naden goes on to say he disposed of Letitia's body along the Macquarie River in a place called Butler's Falls. The police bring in heavy digging equipment to no avail. They decide to bring Naden to the location so he can show them exactly where he'd disposed of her body. He walks to a spot on the beach, smiles at the detectives and said, Here is the spot I dismembered Letitia's body." He dug a hole close to the waterline, dismembered her body with a fishing knife, and buried her remains. Despite a large-scale search in 2012, Letitia's remains would not be found until years later in November 2016. A bushwalker came across a femur just meters from the initial dig site at Butler's Falls. It is believed the evidence was uncovered due to dropping water levels in the Macquarie River due to drought. More bones would be found over the next few months. All were tested for DNA and all confirmed to be those of Letitia Nolan. Malcolm John Naden would plead guilty to 18 charges, some of which included the murder of Letitia Nolan, the murder of Christy Scholes, shooting with intent to murder, offences of aggravated sexual assault, as well as a charge for breaking and entering and theft, which he perpetrated while on the run. On the 14th of June 2013, in the Supreme Court of New South Wales, Malcolm John Naden was sentenced by Justin Derek Price. Naden was sentenced to at least 21 years for the murder of Letitia Nolan, but was given a sentence of life for the murder of Christy Scholes. He will never be released. After spending a year behind bars, Malcolm Naden was seriously assaulted by one of his cousins, Dean Nolan, who was also serving a sentence for murder in Goulburn Supermax prison. Dean Nolan used the handle of a sandwich press to attack Malcolm. The police made a statement that Malcolm only suffered minor injuries in the attack, but Dean Nolan was charged with reckless wounding, something not handed down for minor assaults. There are also reports that Malcolm Naden has attempted suicide numerous times behind bars. All have been unsuccessful. By the time he was caught, Malcolm Naden had been on the run for a total of 2,466 days. During those 2,466 days, it is believed by the police that he was responsible for at least 95 break-and-enter offences. During the span of the manhunt, 500 law enforcement officers would be involved in various roles at various times. Well guys, that wraps up the third episode of From the Gargoyle's Ledge. Please like, share and subscribe. Thanks for listening and tune in next time.